Safe to say that Tony Blair isn't happy with Keir Starmer's performance as Prime Minister, and he's weighed in with a 5,000-word essay on his own website. And the reason I wanted to cover this is because so far most of the discourse around this essay, Tony Blair's subsequent appearance on the BBC with Safe Pair of Hands, Nick Robinson, and Starmer's rather petulant response, misses the insights that Blair provides and also doesn't examine the contours of the influence war that's going on through this piece. I saw a lot of, let's say, slop-coded commentary about how this being an unprecedented intervention by Tony Blair, a former Prime Minister, a damning indictment of Starmer's premiership, him castigating all of the major players in the Labour Party for being woefully insufficient compared to his own leadership style, and there's a little bit of truth to that. I mean, he does open the piece by saying, I'm afraid, like many progressive parties, Labour has an almost infinite capacity for self-delusion. He does point out that he likes Streeting and Burnham, that he respects Keir Starmer's efforts at winning the last general election. But a lot of this is about Blair trying to make a play for being the sovereign over politics, as in, like, party politics, rather than trying to get the Labour Party back on his agenda per se. I mean, he would quite like that, of course, and I assume Blair is still emotionally wedded to the Labour brand, but Blair is a post-party politician because he was capable of remaking all of Westminster politics in his image. It got to the point where David Cameron and Michael Gove were swanning around calling themselves the heir to Blair. Michael Gove was dispensing copies of Blair's autobiography around the Department of Education in the Cameron years. It's a bit like Maggie Thatcher handing out Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, saying, this is what we believe. Blair was so effective a constitutional vandal, implementing the Supreme Court, passing the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act in the legacy Brown years, ensuring that the charities sector became a permanent NGO industrial complex committed to throwing taxpayer cash at diversity, equity, and inclusion projects, expanding the Quangos that Maggie Thatcher herself founded. Thatcher herself said that Blair was the proudest part of her legacy. Blair was so effective a architect of our present permanent bureaucracy that he sees his role as telling parties what to do, as the conductor telling them how to play his tune, rather than just being an ex-prime minister weighing in as if he were any other pundit. Because nobody really cares when John Major or Theresa May makes an intervention. They care when Boris Johnson dares open his trap because he was such an unprecedented traitor we never want to hear from him again. And Blair, it should be the same, but because Blair was so effective at governing against our interests, as Andrew Nether said, he intended to rub the right's nose in diversity and render our arguments out of date. We'll consider my nose well and truly rubbed off, thanks to the 1.8 million migrants that Blair brought in his tenure, and now the 4.9 million that have been brought in by Boris Johnson. It's about 10 million in total since 1997. More immigration, by the way, than between the Norman Conquest of 1066 and the Second World War, thanks, Tone. Blair is so effective in putting our political system on rails in the direction that he wants to go that we can actually learn from him. Most of this essay concerns Blair's political pet projects. AI, greater defence spending, international cooperation, rejoining the European Union. And he's sober on some of these things. He makes concessions to reality. He adds his own little spin on it, of course, but he says, regarding Brexit, he was against the decision of Brexit, but now he's against a rash rejoining because the European Union themselves are in a poor spot, especially hostile to AI. They're trying to legislate innovation out of existence. And of course, Tony Blair, if you read an excellent piece, ironically in the New Statesman, inside the Tony Blair Institute, he is close partners with Larry Ellison, owner of Oracle and TikTok, Paramount ByteDance, the largest single private donator to the IDF, the guy who thinks that your phone should be recording you at all times and should AI delete out the sections where you're going to the toilet, because it should be able to tell. Tony Blair and Larry Ellison have a good working relationship. Ellison has funded the Institute to the tune of billions, and then Blair has then taken employees at the request of Larry Ellison, or the suggestion, I should say, and then passed them on to various government departments, particularly in Keir Starmer's government. And then this has netted Oracle some rather lucrative contracts with government departments like the Treasury, the NHS, Department for Work and Pensions. And there's a bit of a battle going on between this and the next government, where Peter Thiel's Palantir would quite like to become the operating software of the UK government, just as it has in the US, thanks to its links to the Trump administration via J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy. But anyway, there's a bit of a battle going on between Ellison and Thiel as to who gets the government contracts once the UK finally onboards itself to this digital industrial revolution that Tony Blair talks so much about in this piece. And what Blair is saying here is the European Union are fundamentally hostile to AI, so we can't rejoin because that would strangle Britain's business and tech sector, and he has quite a lot of vested interest in that sector. And also this is, again, a covert influencing exercise pushing the Tony Blair Institute and Larry Ellison's interests into government policy under the cloak of being non-political, non-partisan, post-political even, being the prerequisite set of plans and policies formulated before it ever makes contacts with the political system. And what Blair wants to do is get every single political party to sign on the dotted line of his plans because it seems eminently sensible. He calls this the radical centre. He says that centrism is the most desired political position. That's fundamentally untrue. I mean, the British public are to the right on social issues like the death penalty and migration, various sexual libertine attitudes. It's not that Britain doesn't have a bawdy history with carry-ons, but we're not quite so on board for the pride parades. It sort of offends general sensibilities. They're to the right on social issues. Your average Labour voter is than your average Conservative MP, and now many Reform MPs as well, given their Conservative defectors. So it's not that centrism per se, as Blair would have it, the sort of social progressivism that he snuck in to New Labour. It's not that that's popular. It's that competence is popular. It's that leadership is popular. It is a style that is popular, and that's why Blair won successive elections despite doing unpopular things like the Iraq War. And he's correct when he says later on in this piece that there is a fundamental problem. The people don't want politics as usual. The real reason behind the rise of leaders like Donald Trump, Giorgia Meloni, Javier Milei, is they answer the call. You can like them or dislike them, but their chief characteristic is they appear to be unbound, not constrained by conventional thinking. I would put Nayib Bukele at the top of this list, transforming El Salvador from one of the most dangerous countries in the world to one of the safest in the Western Hemisphere just by locking up 1% of the population based on skull tattoos that they put on their face. It's nice of them to sort of mark themselves out from the law-abiding citizens of El Salvador like that. He writes, I have experience working with the Trump administration, and I describe the difference with conventional politics in this way. The conventional leader sets a destination down the road. They drive towards it, they come to a brick wall, barring the way, they stop at the wall, sit down and consider all the options, keep considering, finally take a decision to go round, through, or over the wall, but it's a complicated process. It takes time, and there is a constant pulling back by a cautious system. This is the thing that Schmidt is reported to have joked in the intro written by Tracy B. Strong to Concepts of the Political, that the liberal, if asked who to crucify, Christ or Barabbas, will convene a committee, and by the time that committee is adjourned and has come up with a verdict, the wrong man has been crucified. So liberalism is deferring sovereignty until such a point where the existential threat has grown and grown and grown, and it becomes impossible to ignore, and it also becomes impossible to solve. And this is what Blair is actually describing. Blair is a non-Schmittian in that he thinks things should be non-political, and of course the contention by Schmidt is that all things are political or they pretend not to be, and if they pretend not to be, then you're just ignoring the existential threat posed to your side, your way of life, your friends, by your enemies, and eventually that threat will engulf you. So always confront the threats. Never fall prey to the delusion that your way of life, your preferred method of exercising your sovereignty is non-political. But Blair pretends to be non-political so that he can smuggle his agenda in as the status quo, the default assumption, just the neutral guardrails in which politics takes place. And he's clever to do so. Anyway, he says, The unconventional leader, in this case President Trump, drives down the road, sees the brick wall, and accelerates. Yes, there are bits flying off the bus, there is a fair amount of debris and damage, the passengers feel mildly nauseous. With luck, he's through the wall. It is simultaneously high in potential risk and in potential effectiveness. The risk, of course, is if any wall on the journey turns out to be not a few inches, but a few feet thick. I'm not advocating this approach, merely describing its appeal. It seems to be the answer to the efficacy challenge. And today, the frustration with the system is such that people are inclined to take the risk, because anything is better than the agonizing irritation of incremental change that never seems to deliver real change. In a way, he's rebuking Fabianism here, because he's saying that the incremental approach to revolution doesn't work in the digital age where the news cycle spins up far faster than most politicians can react to, with the cabinet office and ministerial briefings and Cobra meetings. Even 5-year plans, as Keir Starmer seems so fond of generating. What he's actually saying, though, is that Tony Blair himself is kind of the airbags on Trump's bus, cushioning the blows that his vested interests have, who have decided to board the bus, seeing that Trump was the only driver getting them to where they want to go, and protecting them from the debris that might fly through the windows as Trump drives through said walls. Of course, there's one wall that Trump won't drive through. Anyway, Tony Blair can be a credible voice on this because he's on the Gaza Peace Board. And there's a point in the Nick Robinson interview, which we'll watch a clip of in the moment. But there's a point where Nick Robinson clarifies, you're on the Gaza Peace Board. Are you above the governments that you're telling to get around the table and collaborate on regional stability, on rebuilding Gaza, or are you below it? And Blair seems to say that he's working below the governments, but of course, a supranational institution only has jurisdiction if the states themselves agree to subordinate some of their sovereignty to it as an authority. Whether they're signing themselves up to a treaty, whether or not they're taking their guidance to inform the sovereign decisions that they make. Tony Blair is saying, I sit above the government on the Gaza Peace Board that I have been appointed by President Trump to advise, to shepherd towards our preferred agenda in the region. And what Tony Blair is saying here, hear the signal through the noise. The noise is Tony Blair is criticising Labour. He wants Keir Starmer to either bend the knee or the next Labour Prime Minister that replaces Starmer to govern by the Blair playbook, which is digital IDs and more contracts for Oracle. That's true. But hear the signal through the noise. Blair is saying that he wants to sit above politics. This isn't just about the Labour leadership. This is about the present government because Labour happens to be in power, and of course Blair was Labour Prime Minister. What he's actually saying here, and as he says in his Nick Robinson interview, which we'll play a clip of, is that he wants to sit above politics and advise the next government, no matter which party it is. It doesn't matter whether it's Labour, it won't be, Conservatives, definitely won't be, or Reform. And there is reason to suspect, I'm not saying Reform are working with Tony Blair, just before this gets put in the comments, before people accuse me of some sort of schizoid conspiracy theory, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is there is a reason to suspect there might be some openness to it, given Blair has a significant amount of leverage now, working with Larry Ellison, who is, for some reason, heavily involved in the Trump government, because of course Trump oversaw the sale of TikTok to Ellison, and also he's involved in the Gaza Peace Board, but also because previously, despite Farage now saying Blair is to blame for our constitutional vandalism for mass migration, despite Danny Kruger and James Orr and David Starkey all blaming Blair for that constitutional vandalism, wanting to undo it, Nigel Farage did previously say that Tony Blair should be vaccine czar during the pandemic. So Nigel Farage, being a boomer, or the upper echelons of Gen X, which is a permeable barrier with the boomers, being someone who still trusts institutions implicitly, even if they're failing, Nigel Farage is inclined towards this way of doing politics that doesn't feel political. He is somewhat comfortable with outsourcing decisions, or particularly difficult decisions, to non-political processes. He doesn't like the cut and thrust of politics because he might get called a racist if he makes executive decisions. The only time that he's actually broken from this consensus really is Brexit, and I'm not knocking that. But even then, he did it in a safe way. Remember, he said he wanted fewer Polish plumbers and more Indian doctors. So, he basically wanted the demographic composition of the Boris wave, if not the raw numbers of the Boris wave. And the reason I think that Blair is making his play here to essentially advise reform, counting Labour out of forming the next government, and also try to advise Labour in the interim years before the reform comes in, is because when he was asked this question by Nick Robinson, he was quite rhetorically coy. Now, Blair is masterful at answering questions. He is very expressive. Dr. Parvini, who is the student of Blair's dark arts, spoke about this when he went through this interview and essay. Blair uses his power hands. He's not quite Italian, but he's very authoritative. He speaks with... He uses hand motions to make points. And he always butters up the interviewer after they ask him a tough question by saying, "That's a great point. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, that's true. But," and then pivots away. He almost delivers his answers like a compliment sandwich. And so he endears the interviewer and, way back when, members of the public to him, even though he's saying things that are coded or nefarious. But this was an interesting answer. He was very coy about his loyalty to the Labour Party. And that's, again, because he wants to be supra-political, sit above politics, but also because I think that he wants to curry favour with the next government because he knows, he's very politically astute, that Labour are on the way out. And so if he can reroute the public outrage that is being siphoned into Reform UK at the moment, and then repurpose a Reform government for his agenda, then he's contained your anger and rerouted it to his agenda. Let's listen.
Hold on a second. People might say, look, Labour was elected on a promise of change. It got a vast majority on the basis of that promise. And here you are arguing that when Labour ministers came to office, they should have ripped up their promise to protect workers with more rights, to increase the minimum wage, to turn our energy supply green and clean. Blair comes along and says, no, forget all that. Now you're in office. That's a daft idea.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. But here's the problem. If this AI revolution is what I say it is, and if we need higher levels of growth as a country, which we obviously do, then even if you put these things in a manifesto, and let's be clear, I don't think Labour won the last election because people read the manifesto and said, this is what we want. I think people thought that Conservatives have behaved completely unacceptably, and to Keir Starmer's great credit, the Labour Party was an acceptable alternative.
I was absolutely correct about this, by the way. Starmer won with fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn gained and lost by in 2019. So he understands that Labour is on borrowed time as a brand, and that Keir Starmer himself has squandered the opportunity to put Blair's vision through. Keir Starmer met with all of Blair's favourite key players in the early days of his tenure in Downing Street. He met with Bill Gates and Larry Fink. But Keir Starmer has approached the issue of digital ID both incompetently and softly. And that's not what Blair wants. Blair wants total digital ID, essentially a technocratic surveillance state, which then provides lucrative contracts to his public and private partnerships. The fact that he is saying this, the fact that he's saying, well, people didn't really like the Labour manifesto. People didn't want Ed Miliband to impoverish them with his windmills. They didn't really want David Lammy running around being the foreign secretary. But what he's saying is, don't get deluded and think the public love what you're doing. You're on borrowed time. Listen to me. I might be able to salvage some of your seats if you play nicely. But this is also a shot across the bow to Labour. This is Blair not wanting to own the actions of his descendants. Because Starmer is as much the heir to Blair as Blair is the heir to Thatcher. Also, a side point. It's interesting how he's cut his hair and no longer looks like the villain from Ghostbusters 2. It's almost like he's re-emerged from a cocoon, anticipating that he's going to have to weigh in to public affairs and has to look somewhat presentable again.
When it came in, it saw the state of the inheritance. I think at that point, of course it would be difficult. Everything in politics is difficult. But if I'd been them, I'd say, look, all of these commitments, they may be very worthwhile. They may be proper commitments in easy times. But in these hard times, we've got to prioritise growth. We've got to prioritise support for the business sector. And this artificial intelligence revolution, we've got to grasp it, both its opportunities and its risks, with both hands.
What Blair is saying, and this is why it was amusing when he opened his response to the next question with, that's a really great point, but essentially translate to, no, this is bullshit and here's why. What he's saying is abandon your current agenda and enforce my policies. Otherwise, all of these policies are going to be inherited by reform and they're going to get done anyway, and you're not going to win the next election. Because he believes this is also the best thing for the country, even if we don't want it. And it's because this is the best thing to be held in the esteem of the international institutions, the financial markets, the UN, the WHO, the WEF, all of these supranational bodies that Blair is a creature of. And so Blair believes that Britain will succeed in the eyes of those supranational bodies. Its GDP will go up, it will be seen as an innovative technological hub on the cusp of the cutting edge of the next industrial revolution, as he keeps saying, if they do these things, whether or not it has any tangible benefits for us, whether or not we feel like we belong in our own country again. And what Blair is saying is, presuming that the current incentives remain in place, you need to do these things. And to ensure that the current incentives remain in place, I would like to be as a vizier to the next government, who might be less reliable heirs to my agenda, no matter what the party might be.
And so I think, yes, it would have been tough, but I think you could have explained to the country why it was necessary.
And there are more tough things that you propose in this essay. You talk about fundamental reform of welfare. Saying what to voters?
Saying that, for example, we're about to end up in a situation where just before the pandemic, it was only 5 or 6 years ago, we had 2.8 million people, working age people on disability incapacity benefits. We're going to have, by the end of this decade, almost 5 million people. Right? You can't carry on. You can't carry on in a situation where you're going to end up, if you're not careful, spending more on incapacity and disability benefits than you are on defence.
That's the reason he actually opposes this. It's not that he doesn't want an expansive welfare state. Remember, Blair ballooned the size of the civil service, increased NHS spending. I think about 75% of all the jobs he also created in the state went to women, as it happens. As Orwell said in 1984, it was always the women that were the most fervent activists for the party. But the reason that Blair says this is because he, again, concedes to realpolitik in the subheading of the essay titled The New World Order. It says, politics at an international level has always been primarily about power. It doesn't mean values are irrelevant, on the contrary. But protection of those values also requires power. Because powerful nations have a habit of getting what they want, and less powerful nations don't. What is power derived from? From the strength of a country's economy and the strength of its military capacity. He is saying, it's not that I'm not a true believer in the revolution. It's not that I'm not a globalist utopian ideologue. But the instruments of achieving this global utopia are raw military might, international cooperation, resource security. There are material constraints on your ideology. This is why he's against the Greens, even though the Greens are currently nipping at the heels of Labour among the younger generation migrants, the client classes that Blair moved Labour over to, abandoning the working class. The reason that they're doing that, they're making inroads there, is because they're saying we want 100% of the revolution, we've never been in government, and therefore we don't have to make concessions to reality to enact our ideology, whereas Labour have been a party of government, particularly under Blair, an effective party of government, the last Labour Prime Minister prior to Starmer who was capable of winning an election, and so they can only do 90% of the revolution, and they can only do it gradually. And what Blair is saying is, don't message as if you're doing a gradual revolution, but if you would like to achieve the gradual revolution, then these are the instruments through which the revolution is conducted, and these are also the limits of those instruments. And at the moment, you have a depleted military capacity, but there's no such thing as soft power. Stop swanning around pretending that Britain has these incredible cultural exports that will convince enemy nations that are devouring us in manufacturing capacity and innovation and population. Stop pretending that this is going to persuade them. And you don't have the money to spend anymore, even if you wanted to upgrade your military capacity. Because, and Blair's quite ironic to speak about this, of course, because thanks to Blair's expansion of the deficit, thanks to his mass migration policies, the Conservative government inherited an economy where there was a note at the Treasury saying, sorry, no money left. And of course, this is, again, the mismanagement of the economy is a product of Tony Blair's way of thinking. 1997, one of the first things that he did with Gordon Brown as his Chancellor was make the Bank of England independent, unaccountable, therefore able to keep pulling the lever on the money printer, keep fiddling about with interest rates, devaluing our savings, inflating the cost of housing beyond that which the current generation can afford. He set the precedent with mass migration to where now, he's talking about young people out of work on disability benefits. For every one Brit that is employed at the moment, 27 non-EU third world migrants are employed in their stead. This is all the product of the non-political, independent institutions and globalization ethos that Blair said, I think it was in 2003 at Labour Party conference, was as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. What Blair is saying here is, I don't disagree with the fundamentals of what we're trying to do in terms of the vision. What I disagree with is the delivery, because at the moment, your incompetent, inefficient means of delivering the revolution is jeopardizing the revolutionary project. And he's also saying you need a new sales pitch, not just because you're going to get voted out of office, the Labour Party, but because I'm currently reinventing my sales pitch so that I can pitch it to the successive government, because I would quite like to keep my political project on rails. Thank you very much.
All of these changes are really difficult, which is why I think whoever takes them on is going to have a really tough time. But it's like the triple lock on pensions. You look at the figures and you look at where Britain's going to be in 20, 30 years' time if it continues with this policy. It's not affordable. And at some point, you've got to be able to stand up and have an honest debate with the public, which is to say, look, ultimately, we're probably taxing people too much, spending too much, borrowing too much at the moment. If we carry on like this, with these large increases in incapacity benefit, with the triple lock on pensions, we're going to create a situation where economically we're not able to grow because we've put such a weight affecting growth on the back of our economy.
And there's yet more of these difficult choices. You talk on health of a fundamental realignment, getting rid of old shibboleths. Now, most people reading that will say, if not privatisation of the health service, much greater involvement of the private sector. Is that right?
Yeah, it is right. Because let me tell you why. The whole of healthcare this is part of this artificial intelligence revolution. It's going to revolutionise drug discovery. It allows you, if you use data properly inside the health service, to engage in a completely different way of organising your healthcare system. People are already, if they can afford to, for example, these weight loss drugs, right? We've got a program that makes them available. This whole debate about, are you privatising, inverted commas, the NHS? But when I was in office, we improved the NHS and we doubled the spending on it. But it's a different world today, and you've got both the opportunity and the responsibility to do healthcare completely differently.
Well, we've got the agenda now. Let's turn a little bit to the leadership. And people might think, listening to this, well, we know who advocates all this. It's Kemi Badenoch. It's the leader of the Conservative Party.
No, it's Nigel Farage. In fact, Tony Blair here sounds even more ruthless in terms of rebalancing Britain's debt to GDP ratio and committed spending to pensions and the NHS than Farage does himself. Farage is petrified of bad headlines and so says he's not going to privatise any components of the NHS, despite Labour releasing that embarrassing attack ad on him for the local elections that alleged that he would. And also he's committed to keeping the triple lock, even though it's fiscally unsustainable, because he wants to bribe boomers to stop voting Conservative and start voting Reform instead. What Blair is doing is he is making a pitch past the present parties, presuming that Reform will form the next government. Kemi Badenoch isn't even in the equation. Tony Blair. I guarantee Blair can see Badenoch for what she is, which is an elected busted flush, and the Conservatives are a contaminated brand and will never form a government again. And instead, Blair is saying, I'm going to say the fiscally unsayable that the likes of Reform aren't going to say, because these are just the constraints by which my system wants to survive. You know, the Conservatives basically inherited my project and then put it on steroids because they were less competent than I was, speaking as Blair here, and committed to the triple lock under Cameron and Osborne, ramped up immigration under Boris Johnson, became utterly hated, and then Keir Starmer replicated their failures and has made Labour utterly hated too, so hey presto, we have reform. What he's saying is, I want reform to get back to true Blairism. I want them to be the furthest right wing of Blairism, and I would like to supervise that transition. Because in his essay, he actually points out, he says that there's a section on reform and the Greens. He says, whoever is elected the next time will be seen as offering something radical. At present, there are the Greens offering radical leftism, there is Reform offering radical rightism, the Tories are Reform light, the Lib Dems are being Lib Dems, i.e. putting their finger in the wind. Totally irrelevant, it's correct. In these circumstances, if Labour continues to just be Labour, it risks getting sliced to the left and right of itself. And should it actively choose old blue Labour, it might get back some of the so-called red wall, though remember, New Labour kept those seats in 2005 and Labour lost them, subsequently going left, but it then risks losing the parts of the country it gained in the south. Labour's only electorally viable strategy is to become the radical centre, is to become his agenda while pretending it's non-political. And this, by the way, is him finger-wagging at Maurice Glassman, who is a member of Blue Labour, who has made a name for himself being correct about Peter Mandelson being an imprudent choice to be selected as the US ambassador. There's a bunch of files currently being released as I'm recording this right now, including a letter that Mandelson sent to David Lammy saying, ironically, you won't regret appointing me US ambassador. Well, I wouldn't have bet on David Lammy's political acumen, just like I wouldn't bet on David Lammy to know that, that 7 comes after 6, rather than the other way around. Anyway, we all knew that Mandelson would be a terrible appointment, because he's nicknamed the Prince of Darkness after the Lord of Darkness, which is Tony Blair. Nevertheless, this is Blair saying, don't listen to Glassman. Even Shabana Mahmood, who Blair hosted as guest of honour at the Tony Blair Institute's Christmas event in 2025, which is where she said she wants to live in a digital panopticon where the eyes of the state can be on you at all times, hook up Larry Ellison's Oracle software to the British government, make it more efficient to conduct the limited number of deportations or imprisoning people for imprudent tweets that the Labour government wants to conduct. So yes, what Blair is doing is giving Labour a new textbook by which they might be able to see off reform if they just look competent and like they're delivering on economic issues. There's not much in here about immigration. Immigration's mentioned a couple of times, but he doesn't give any substantive policy prescriptions. Also, he mentions the Middle East, by the way, but doesn't mention Israel by name. Instead, he only talks about partners in the Gulf region and investment and regional stability, which is something that Reform are very concerned about because Paul Marshall and the Gartham Investment Bank that's on the GB News Board and Funds Prosperity Institute and a bunch of other people, including Nadim Zahawi, all have business interests out in Dubai. So it's quite interesting. There's a bit of a crossover here between Blair and Reform's business interests. What he's saying is this is the playbook for the next party of government, whether or not it's Labour, and I would like to be involved. He defines the radical centre as, properly defined, where you put policy first and politics last, aka stop squabbling over which colour rosette the Prime Minister gets to wear, and just follow my agenda. My agenda is non-political, my agenda is correct, it has been handed down from stone tablets from heaven, or up from hell in Tony Blair's case, and so he is telling the present government, the future Labour leader, and the next government, play by my rules or else.
Says let's get rid of net zero targets. She says let's get rid of business taxes that are doing damage. She says pretty much everything you've just said. And indeed, Rishi Sunak was in that chair just minutes ago saying, yeah, I wholeheartedly endorse the lot.
Yeah, he does wholeheartedly endorse the lot, by the way, including the artificial intelligence revolution, including things like digital ID and so on, which we can come to if you want.
Straight from the horse's mouth, by the way, the Conservatives wholeheartedly endorse Blair's agenda and have done under previous Prime Ministers. Interesting.
You see, I'm not asking the question about is it Tory, is it Reform, is it Greens, is it Labour? I'm just saying, okay, take a step back, analyse the world, where do we go? And I don't really... I think part of the problem with the way we have this debate is that it always does start and usually end with politics.
You started a sentence there and you stopped. I don't really. I thought you were going to say, I don't really care.
Well, I was going to say, I don't really care whether it's left or right in a traditional sense.
You don't really care whether it's Labour anymore, do you? In that sense, well, as the policies.
I don't think Labour's got something. I'm not tribal in the sense that I think one political party is going to have the exclusive capability of deciding the right answer. And
no, the only person with the exclusive ability to define what is the right answer, in Tony Blair's mind, is Tony Blair. So he actually doesn't care which party takes government, so long as they're playing by his agenda. And so, that includes reform. This is Tony Blair on manoeuvres to persuade the reform government, that he presumes is going to come in 2029, current polling suggests they will, to just adopt his agenda wholesale, because that would also minimise the bad press and detonation of a potential fiscal time bomb they might inherit from Rachel Reeves and Labour in their own hands that awaits them as things stand. Because the current accusation of reform, believe it or not, is that they don't have well thought out comprehensive policies. They don't have the personnel. They don't have the talent, the thinking behind them. And look, Danny Kruger's published an encouraging document about making civil servants eligible to be hired, fired, at ministerial discretion, reorganising the government and the cabinet to be directly accountable to the Prime Minister and therefore elected ministers below him. All of that's pretty good, but the veiled threat Blair is making is if you underestimate the scale of the pressure that me and my international friends will place you under, your project will come undone. So maybe adopt some of the elements of my agenda and I'll get them to ease off a little bit.
You know, the interesting thing when you go out of politics, and this is where I think the most interesting politics today comes from people outside of politics. Because when you step out of politics and you start seeing how the world is changing, it's not really about traditional left and right politics. In fact, I think that gets in the way a lot of the time of just asking the question, okay, look at the world. How do we make sense of it? How do we keep Britain strong? Its economy strong? How do we build its military and so on?
Translation: my agenda is non-political. You guys are spending too much time on the WWE personality matchups. It's all kayfabe, it's all for the cameras. Let's get back to my agenda, which is beyond politics, above politics, which dictates the terms of engagement upon which politics do battle. And what I think rubbed Starmer up the wrong way, because Starmer has responded to this, was this devastating insight towards the start. The government's principal problem isn't Keir Starmer's personality, or a failure to communicate our achievements, or a need to assert more strongly Labour's values. It's because we don't have a worked-out, coherent plan for the country in a fast-changing world, and are in the wrong political position from which we can devise one and win a second term. Basically, as Starmer is currently doing things, not listening to Blair, like he was right before the election, on things like the definition of a woman. As Starmer currently does things, Labour is obsolete. And so he's trying to generate internal pressure from the Labour Party to listen to him and carry out his agenda. And he's also exerting pressure ahead of someone succeeding Starmer to follow his agenda. And he's positioning himself well to advise a future reform government with the implied threat that they will come undone if they don't make concessions to Blair's agenda. But the worst thing you can tell someone in politics, in Westminster specifically, in the Westminster bubble, is it's not just a comms problem. Because everything is believed to be just a comms problem. This is the delusion that Labour keep telling themselves. We just aren't communicating our wins effectively to the public enough. No, people hate what you're doing to them. But they have a priori, ahead of time, defined, according to their ideology, every action they take to be correct, even if the public doesn't like it, because it's in the public's self-interest, because we're all blank slates, we're all equal, we all have the same material interests underneath, and so if they just keep subsidising various social welfare programs, if they just keep expanding public education, if they just keep suppressing the indigenous identity and our natural mistrust of foreigners, as George Orwell says, and amplifying the benefits of diversity, the food and the clothing and the flags, and downplaying the crimes of multiculturalism, then suddenly everything will be harmonious. They believe this ahead of time, which is why Keir Starmer's response was essentially get fucked. Quote, Tony Blair might not like my plan, but he's wrong. It's changing Britain for the better. Well, that's a hell of a repudiation. The stubborn gigachad of Keir Starmer, who, by the way, today has just banned Hassan Piker and Cenk Uygur from the UK. And Hassan's saying, oh, it's because we criticise Israel. I mean, that's possible. Keir Starmer is sitting on a powder keg of social tensions between the various imported minority communities in our country. One that just so happens to go around stabbing the other, while the one that's getting stabbed, unfortunately, its advocacy organisations constantly agitate for bringing said stabby people into our country, and then when we proposed deporting them, they said we should form an alliance with said stabby people. But anyway, that's not the topic of today's video. Hassan is saying, well, I think we've been banned because we've criticised Israel. Okay, I don't care, actually. I don't think that's the criteria why we should be banning people. But I'm glad that he's banned Hassan, and someone did joke that he broke out the bug spray. Nevertheless, Starmer, by being just committed to procedure, impervious to feedback, either from the public who hate him, most unpopular Prime Minister on record, or even Tony Blair, one of his seniors, is just marching on and doing hilarious things like banning Hassan Piker, but inadvertently destroying the Labour Party in the process. And again, I'm all here for it. The only thing I'm worried about is, of course, the capture of the next government by Blair, and I'm seeing concerning signs that, well, if Reform do form the next government, I don't think their immune system is quite as impervious as most of us would like to the heavy hand of Blair on their shoulder. But I thought what was worthy of note in Keir Starmer's Substack post, which is otherwise just predictable leftoid duck speak. It's just, we have achieved lots of things on cutting welfare waste and improving the economy and deporting people, and they haven't. It's all just fudge numbers. But the most important thing about this piece is the last paragraph. One final disagreement with Tony. He argues that this is not about stronger assertion of Labour values. I know what he means. On their own, absent of a plan, values take you nowhere. But Britain does need Labour values. It has needed Labour values for a while. Our plan is guided by them. Our vision is shaped by them. And the future we're building, a country that feels like it truly belongs to us all, must use them as its brick and mortar. Again, it might be boring platitudes, but what that is a complete repudiation of the assumptions that Tony Blair is making. Tony Blair is saying, you need to make concessions to the markets. You need to be slightly less ideological for now. You need to focus on doing things that will win elections, otherwise the party is going to go bust. But Keir Starmer is an ideologue. He always has been. While Tony Blair, as Pete Hitchens has written, kept his Trotskyism quiet when he was at Oxford, Keir Starmer was a member of the Haldane Society, a society of communist lawyers that split from the Society of Labour Lawyers over their support for the USSR and the Communist Party. He wrote for a Marxist collective journal about the expropriation of property and was interviewing former Labour leader Tony Benn and saying that Labour needs to become a party that is a coalition of the oppressed classes. He was in favour of Pabloism, an obscure identitarian form of Trotskyism, based on a guy who fought in the Algerian Civil War and then was booted out when his side lost, which promotes red, green, pink politics, feminist issues, LGBT issues, and ecological issues, which explains why his cabinet is packed with feminists, or was, like Yvette Cooper and Jess Phillips, monitoring Andrew Tate clips using the Cabinet Office. It explains why Ed Miliband is currently dismantling our energy security, cementing up all of the remaining oil wells in the North Sea, and making our energy costs the highest in the developed world, and why Keir Starmer has so many Ukrainian rent boys who know his home address. What Keir Starmer is saying is, actually, he has so internalized the ideology, he's such a doctrinaire believer in himself and his mission, and enacting the revolution through legal means as a lawyer, as one of the members of the Fabian Society. He's so committed to the revolution that he doesn't care what Tony Blair has to say. And so this unprecedented intervention by Tony Blair, it's not that unprecedented, it's a bit scathing, but it's just going to go in one ear and out the other for the Starminator. Whether or not someone will succeed Starmer, who knows? I mean, you're going to have to drag him out of Downing Street with his fingernails scratching up the black door. Whether or not his successor will abide by Blair's playbook, I mean, possibly. Burnham, if he wins the Makerfield by-election, might well do. But I don't think he will reverse Labour's fortunes. I don't think the public are actually in the mood for more Blairism. I think, at this point, immigration is the number one issue, and if you just don't get rid of the Boris wave walking through the high streets, if you don't shut down all of the dodgy Turkish barbers and vape shops that are the manifest injustice that they feel every day, they feel their dispossession. If you don't do that, then there's nothing that can save you in the Red Wall, especially. Labour has lost these people forever, as have the Conservatives, because they're just as guilty of this as Labour. And so this is why I thought I wanted to highlight Tony Blair's essay, because this is Blair making a play for governing reform by proxy. He says the centre has a supply problem, not demand one. The centre should never be the place of managing the status quo or of splitting the difference between left and right or just being moderate. Rather, as I said earlier, the centre is the place where policy comes first and politics second. You work out the correct analysis, then the correct answer, and shape your political strategy around it. Where, therefore, the correct answer requires radical change, the centre should be the radical change maker. This is the vacant space of British politics. The vacant space is not necessarily party political, it's he who generates the policy. Now, I might suggest to Mr. Blair that generating the policy from the Tony Blair Institute might mean that the estuaries that you're hoping people drink from downstream are already poisoned. Nevertheless, there is a very real risk that Tony Blair and his proxies and his vested financial interests start setting the policy agenda that the next government inherits. And so, unless you vote for a truly anti-establishment option that despises everything Tony Blair has done to the country and is condemning it in explicit terms, and is laying out in intricate detail how they plan to repeal everything that Blair did, and from before, all the things that Blair inherited and exacerbated, the Race Relations Act, the British Nationality Act of 1948, unless you vote for the person that is willing to do all that stuff, then you're going to get the Dark Lord ruling from his throne well beyond the black gates of Mordor, but the Prime Minister is going to be communing with him via the Palantir, ironically enough, and doing his bidding nonetheless.